Was alcohol always forbidden in Islam? When one looks into this topic or asks Muslims about it, one certainly gets the impression that alcohol is and has always been completely forbidden in the religion. But is this necessarily true? About a year ago, I released a short here on YouTube about this precise topic. Actually, that was sort of a snippet from a much larger video about Ibn Sina. But I noticed in that short, which has gotten quite a lot of views and responses, that a lot of people seem confused, especially Muslims seem confused and think that I'm making things up, basically, or that I've misunderstood something. So I thought I would make a more proper video where we go through this topic, where we look at the sources directly and see where the opinions of especially the early school, like the early jurists and representatives of certain schools, especially the Hanafi school of law, sort of diverge from the expected position on things like alcohol. So the basic fact is that today, if you ask any Muslim jurist or scholar, most will indeed unequivocally say that any form of alcohol is forbidden and in any quantity. This includes all the legal schools or madhabs in Islam, including the Hanafis. But this wasn't always necessarily the case, and this was in fact something that developed over time. First of all, this is not referring to what can be called the progressive prohibition of wine that we find in the Quran itself. So in the Quran, there are several references to wine and intoxication that can appear somewhat contradictory. But this is interpreted basically universally to be a case of abrogation, where one verse was revealed at one point and then another later on that abrogated or overruled the first. At first, general consumption seems to have been allowed, but the believers are specifically asked not to be intoxicated while coming to prayer. Quote, "O you who acknowledge, do not go near prayer, salat, while you are stupefied under influence, until you know what you are saying." But later on, this seems to have changed into a more strict and more total encouragement against all consumption of wine, with the most forceful verse probably being the one from Surah al-Ma'idah, quote, "O you who have believed, indeed, khamr, wine, gambling, sacrificing on stone altars to other than God, and divining arrows are but defilements from the work of Satan, so avoid it that you may be successful." Here, the believers are told to avoid wine completely. And the word used for wine here is khamr. This will become very important for the discussion. In the Arabian milieu of the Quranic event and the life of the Prophet Muhammad, this word would have referred to wine primarily. Many later on would use it to refer to all kinds of intoxicants, but this is a topic that we will discuss more later. This definition of the word becomes relevant. The Hadith literature also has even more statements about wine and intoxicants that are even clearer in their expression, and we will get to those a bit later, and you will see why soon. So this is the Quranic precedent that the early Muslims were working with, and based on it, different scholars in the wider community and in the proto-schools of jurisprudence disagreed on exactly how to interpret it and how to read it, which also, of course, very much affected their conclusions about it. In short, in the earliest days, and therefore before the establishment of the formal schools of law, the adherents of what would become the Maliki and Shafi'i schools, as well as most Shi'is as well, agreed on a general prohibition on all forms of alcohol and in all quantities. They used different methodologies to get at this position, which we can explore more later on, but they all basically held this general prohibition. But the Hanafis, including the school's founder Abu Hanifah and his students Ash-Shaybani and Abu Yusuf, disagreed. Instead, their opinion was one of narrow prohibition. This conclusion and argument rested on a few different points. Central among them being the reading of the word khamr in the Quran to refer specifically to fermented, uncooked, or cooked sometimes grape juice, and often also date juice. On this basis, and because the encouragement against it in the Quran is so clear, this narrowly defined drink of khamr, as date juice in particular, was prohibited in all circumstances and all quantities. But for any other intoxicating drink that wasn't specifically fermented grape juice, so khamr in the Quran, such as nabidh or naqi, that were made through different methods but nonetheless were intoxicating, the same position didn't hold. The Hanafis here argued that it was the intoxication itself that was prohibited. And so for any intoxicating drink that didn't fall under the narrow definition of khamr, these drinks were allowed unless one drank to the point of intoxication. It was only the last cup that intoxicated that was prohibited, not the preceding ones. In places like Ash-Shaybani's Kitab al-Athar, we see them using reports, hadiths, as well as arguments to support this position, including a famous one about Omar ibn al-Khattab. Quote, Muhammad al-Shaybani said, Abu Hanifah informed us from Ahmed that Ibrahim an-Nakhai said that Omar was brought a desert Arab who had become drunk. He tried to look for an excuse for him, but when he couldn't do that because of the departure of his intellect, he said, lock him up, and when he is sober, flog him. He called for the remains left in the small water skin and tasted it, discovering it to be impossibly strong nabidh, and so he called for water and diluted it, and Omar used to like strong drink. Then he drank and gave the people sitting with him to drink. He said, dilute this with water when its shaitan overcomes you. Muhammad al-Shaybani said, we adhere to this, and it is the verdict of Abu Hanifah, may Allah exalted is He, have mercy on him. This report is thus used to show that the drink, nabidh in this case, that is intoxicating, is fine to drink as long as intoxication doesn't happen, since Omar himself and other companions drank this strong, intoxicating nabidh when it was diluted with water. And Shaybani also uses another tradition and argument about the companion Ibn Mas'ud. Quote, Muhammad al-Shaybani said, Abu Hanifah informed us from Ahmed, who said, I used to be wary of nabidh, and then I went to see Ibrahim an-Nakhai when he was eating and I ate with him. He was brought a vessel of nabidh, but when he saw my hesitation over it, he said, Al-Qama narrated to me from Abdullah ibn Mas'ud that he, Al-Qama, would sometimes eat with him, and then he, that is Abdullah, would call for some of his nabidh, which Sirin, Abdullah's Walad, had prepared for him, and he drank and gave me to drink. In fact, this became an important argument for the early Hanafis, that since companions of the Prophet seemed to drink intoxicating beverages, including even the Caliph Omar, how could they possibly prohibit it? Right? That would be going against the actions of the companions, which is sort of a big no-no in the religion. I know some of you might be thinking that this seems to go against some clear hadiths that state otherwise, but we have to remember that this was very early on in Islamic history, before the formal science of fiqh had been developed in such a way that hadith played the central role that it does today. This was a time when the Sunnah and the Hadith weren't seen as synonymous. The Sunnah, as the normative precedent of the Prophet and the companions and ancestors, was a broader category that was embodied in the local communities that traced their origin back to companions of the Prophet. The community carried the Sunnah and tradition forward and legitimized it, including rulings made through reasoning or personal opinion of jurists, which was called ra'i or ijtihad, or sometimes even caliphs that in themselves could become part of the wider Sunnah as such. It's really only with the work of Imam al-Shafi'i that a new conception of the Hadith and their part in the science of jurisprudence emerges and eventually becomes very popular. To him, after the Quran, it is the Sunnah defined specifically as being taken from the Hadiths that is normativity creating, including solitary reports, khabr al-ahad, as long as they had an isnad or a chain to the Prophet. This was not how Hadiths were seen or used previously. The Hanafis at this time belonged to a movement often known as the Ahl Ra'i, or people of reasoned opinion. They were given this name because they emphasized the personal reasoning of the individual jurist to arrive at legal rulings. These interpretations would of course be based on things like the Quran and the Sunnah of the community, but was itself also seen as part of the wider scope of the Sunnah, so reasoning was part of Sunnah. Now Hadiths did indeed play a role here. Hanafi jurists could use hadiths and sometimes as part of their reasoning, but it was not an essential part of their methodology. They were generally skeptical of khabar ahad, reports of hadiths that were transmitted by only one or a few people. The more secure categories of hadith, such as al-mutawatir, were of course normative to the Hanafis too, but they were so partly because they were so obviously part of the wider understanding of the community that they almost weren't really needed as such anyway. But solitary reports were problematic and were not binding as normative as such. Now, to clarify, these so-called solitary reports or hadiths were the vast majority of hadiths as we know them today, including the so-called sahih or authentic hadiths in collections like Bukhari or Muslim. Some more radical Hanafi jurists rejected Khabar Ahad altogether as unreliable, such as Bishr al-Marisi, but most didn't go this far. Even in a somewhat later Hanafi writer, such as Isa ibn Abban, who wrote at a time when hadiths had become a lot more popular and prominent, and who therefore seems to be trying to create a kind of compromise, he still argues that solitary hadiths are not sunnah in themselves, but must be vetted in their content against the principles of ijtihad and rai, rather than through their chain or isnad, as Shafi'i emphasized, right? So, for example, does the hadith contradict the sunnah, as in the Sunnah widely understood as the understanding of the community? Does it contradict the Quran in some way? Is it widely unknown to the community? Is it narrated by an unreliable companion in terms of narration? Now, an interesting side note here is that Ibn Abban seems to have considered Abu Huraira as one such unreliable narrator, who is the narrator of probably the most, has the most hadiths traced to him, right? So this, just the fact that he considered Abu Huraira to be unreliable, that sort of canceled out a vast amount of the hadiths that are today considered authentic or sahih by most Muslims, right? In short, while the early Hanafis employed hadiths and respected them, when they used them to derive law, it was mostly in a kind of confirmative way. A hadith that aligned with community practice would further cement and confirm that practice, but solitary hadiths weren't that often used as normativity creating sources in themselves. But they were kind of seen as being on the same level as the process of Ra'i. Now, that doesn't mean that they weren't aware of some of the more famous hadiths about intoxication, as I've seen many of the people commenting on my shorter video point out, that Abu Hanifah, he didn't know these hadiths where the Prophet seemingly condemns all intoxicants. They knew these hadiths, right? That is not a viable argument. In fact, Ash-Shaybani narrates in the Kitab al-Athar that Ibrahim an-Nakhai held the opinion that the hadith where the Prophet states that, quote, drinks that intoxicate in large quantities are forbidden in small quantities. He argues that this hadith had in fact been misunderstood by the community. What he really meant was that intoxication itself was forbidden. So they were clearly aware of these hadiths, but simply used other methodology to arrive at their conclusions. Quote, Muhammad al-Shaybani said, Abu Hanifah informed us from Hamad that Ibrahim an-Nakhai said, that of which Allah intoxicates, a little of it is haram, is a mistake on the part of the people. They only meant that intoxication from any drink is haram. So the early Hanafis argued that khamr, which was understood by them specifically to denote uncooked grape wine or grape juice, and in the case of al-Shaybani also cooked grape juice, that this was always forbidden in any quantity, right? Even one drop of this, of khamr, is forbidden. Whereas any other intoxicating drink that is not khamr, which would include intoxicating drinks made from barley or water or milk or whatever, they are allowed to be drunk as long as one doesn't get intoxicated from it, right? So they would say that the last cup that intoxicates is forbidden, right? But not having just one sip of that drink, for example, right? It's the intoxication itself that is forbidden, not a small quantity of that drink. This is the case for all other drinks that does not fall under this category of khamr. But what counts as being intoxicated then? At what point does the person reach a state that is prohibited? Well, a later Hanafi writer, Tahawi, states in his Mukhtasar that Abu Hanifah, may God be pleased with him, used to say, the amount of intoxication is when the intoxicated cannot recognize his friend, distinguish between the ground and the sky, or between a man and a woman. While Abu Yusuf, may God be pleased with him, said, when most of the speaker's words are slurred, he is punished. And this is our opinion. So this is a pretty high bar, right? One has to be completely out of it to be considered intoxicated. although for Abu Yusuf, he's significantly more restrictive in simply counting slurred speech as intoxication. So there were differences of opinions about the definitions of that. Now, with that said, it should be pointed out that even though they didn't want to completely forbid non-khamr intoxicating drinks because of their logical deductions and conclusions, as well as the actions of the Prophet's companions, still, this, of course, doesn't mean that intoxicating drinks are encouraged to drink, right? Absolutely not. This was the opposite, right? Any intoxicating drink, even non-khamr ones, was considered makruh, which strongly discouraged in the religion. But they just didn't want to completely considered haram or completely forbidden. According to Tahawi, who we will meet more later, Ash-Shaybani is quoted as saying, "The consumption of any drink that intoxicates in large quantities should be avoided, but that, quote, I am not forbidding such a drink." So this was the general position of the early Hanafi school, which might be surprising to a lot of you. And it even continued being the standard Hanafi position for centuries, even though certain details and things changed over that time. It didn't change completely into a general prohibition until maybe the 12th century. And while this position is associated primarily with the Hanafi school, it seems that they weren't the only one that held it either. We can look at a much later source, the Bidayat al-Mujtahid, or the Distinguished Jurist Primer by Ibn Rushd. And yes, that is the same Ibn Rushd, or Averroes, famous for his philosophical writings and Aristotelian commentaries that became so important for European scholasticism. But he was, of course, also an Islamic judge and jurist of the Maliki school in Andalusia and the Maghreb, and wrote this work, the Bidayat al-Mujtahid, as a helpful tool for jurists. Now, Ibn Rushd isn't really considered a major authority in the Islamic world in terms of law, but this particular book is very useful and interesting for the fact that it presents the different perspectives from different schools on all different topics, and then also explains the reasoning behind all those different conclusions. And in his section on the question of intoxicating drinks, he says, "With respect to khamr, they agreed about its prohibition in small or large quantities. I mean, that which is derived from grape juice. In the case of other intoxicating beverages, they disagreed about a small quantity that does not intoxicate. They agree that the amount which intoxicates is prohibited. The majority of the jurists of Hijaz, which would be the proto-Malikis primarily, as well as the majority of the traditionists, maintain that small and large quantities of intoxicating liquor are prohibited. The Iraqis, which would be the Hanafis primarily, Ibrahim al-Nakhai from the Tabi'un, Sufyan al-Thawri, Ibn Abi Layla, Shuraik, Ibn Shubrama, Abu Hanifah, and all the remaining jurists of Kufa, as well as the majority of the jurists of Basra, maintained that what is prohibited in all the remaining beverages, that is, beside wine derived from grape juice, is intoxication itself and not the substance of the beverages." And Ibn Rushd himself will then go on to argue for the position of his own Maliki school toward a general prohibition for all intoxicating drinks in all quantities. And that's also precisely the thing. Aside from these figures, the other proto-schools and later schools of jurisprudence did not follow this position. The Malikis and Shafi'is especially would come out and strongly argue against the Hanafi position, instead favoring general prohibition. The Malikis, especially the earliest ones, do this from the perspective of analogical reasoning related to the Quranic verses on Khamr that we quoted before, as well as a few select hadiths. Remember that the early Malikis didn't use hadiths in the way that would become popular later either, but emphasized primarily the community practice of the city of Medina in particular as carrying normative sunnah, to which hadiths played a confirmative role, just like for the Hanafis. Thus, in Malik's own important work, Al-Muwatta, a report of the Prophet is quoted where he responds to a question regarding the drink known as bit, where he says, quote, "Any drink that intoxicates is prohibited." Based on this and a very small amount of other hadiths, they argued with the help of analogical reasoning that the prohibition of khamr in the Quran includes not just fermented grape juice or wine, so to say, but all drinks that intoxicate in whatever quantity it is consumed. Later Malikis, such as Ibn Abi Zayd, also engaged directly with Hanafi arguments for narrow prohibition by arguing, for instance, against the idea that only the last cup that intoxicates is prohibited. He kind of cleverly says that the nature of intoxicating drinks is that they make you want to gradually drink more. So the first cup will inevitably lead to the intoxicating one eventually. Another reasoning device used by the Malikis is to look at the word khamr itself etymologically as indicating something broader, rather than the narrow understanding as fermented grape juice that was common with the Iraqis or Hanafis. Here, the Malikis will argue that the word khamr in Arabic originally means to cover over or obscure something, thus to obscure the mind and its clear thinking. With this in mind, they understand the references to khamr in the Quran to be a reference to all intoxicants rather than just wine, as in grape or date wine. These positions, while sometimes justified or clarified through a few hadith reports, were probably generally associated with and practiced in the Medinan community on the basis of which it was considered authoritative. And we saw this association of general prohibition with the Hijaz in the quote by Ibn Rushd as well. Now, the Shafi'is come to similar conclusions, but by other methods. Perhaps unsurprising given the importance of Shafi'ism for the development of the prominence of normative hadith in Islamic law, their method is primarily textual, based on hadith reports. The most famous hadith widely used in these arguments is the following, quote, "All intoxicants are khamr, and all khamr is prohibited." Interestingly, as we can see, even though the different schools emphasized hadith to different degrees, they all used hadith to support their opinions, and different hadiths. If a Hanafi in the early period even accepted the above hadith as authentic enough to determine law at all, they would argue that the word for intoxicant, miskr, meant specifically the last cup which intoxicates, and not the beverage as a whole. In response to this, Shafi'i scholars like al-Mawardi argued very strongly against this, instead associating intoxication with the drink as a whole. Returning to his Bidayat al-Mujtahid, Ibn Rushd also presents some more interesting details about the Hanafi position and their arguments for it. And this is a long quote, but bear with me. Among traditions that they relied upon in this topic, the best known, in their view, is the tradition of Abu Awan al-Thaqafi from Abdullah ibn Shaddad, from Ibn Abbas, from the Prophet, God's peace and blessings be upon him, who said, "Khamr is prohibited for its substance, and intoxication in things beside it." They said that this is explicit and not susceptible to interpretation. The jurist of Hijaz considered it weak, as some of its narrators related the words intoxicant from other things. Further, there is the tradition of Shuraik from Samak ibn Harb with its isnad from Ibn Burda ibn Niyar, who said, "I used to forbid you from drinking beverages in certain containers, so drink what you like, but do not get intoxicated." It is recorded by Tahawi. It is related from Ibn Mas'ud that he said, "I witnessed the prohibition of nabidh as you witnessed it. Thereafter, I witnessed its permissibility. I remembered and you forgot." They related from Abu Musa that he said, "The Messenger of Allah, God's peace and blessings be upon him, sent me as well as Mu'adh to Yemen. We said, 'O Messenger of Allah, there are two beverages there that they make from wheat and barley. One of them is called mizr and the other is called bita'. Which one should we drink?' He said, 'Drink both, but do not get intoxicated.'" This is also recorded by At-Tahawi. There are other traditions also that they narrate on this subject. In their argument, by way of reasoning, they said that the Quran has explicitly laid down the illah, the underlying cause of prohibition of khamr, is that it prevents the remembrance of Allah and breeds amity and hatred. As the Exalted has said, "Satan seeketh only to cast among you enmity and hatred by means of strong drink and games of chance, and to turn you from remembrance of Allah and from His worship." This illah, they said, is found in a certain quantity of the intoxicating liquor, not on what is less than it. It follows, therefore, that this quantity is prohibited, except on what a consensus has taken place regarding small as well as large quantities of khamr. They said that this kind of analogy is linked with the text, and it is one in which the underlying cause is indicated by the law. A good point to show how this position of narrow prohibition continued to be associated with the Hanafis for many centuries is in discussing someone like Ibn Sina, the great philosopher. Very interestingly, Ibn Sina tells us about some of his study routines, which involved writing down logical problems and pondering over them, examining different opinions and claims in their depth. He describes a standard cozy night of study at his house like this, quote, "At night I would return home, set out a lamp before me, and devote myself to reading and writing. Whenever sleep overcame me or I became conscious of weakening, I would turn aside to drink a cup of wine so that my strength would return to me. Then I would return to reading. Some have been surprised by this, the fact that he as a Muslim would drink alcohol. Although he isn't, of course, upheld as a paragon of strictly observing Muslims in terms of law, this is still a bit surprising to many. And one of the explanations given is that Ibn Sina was, most likely, a Hanafi in terms of his fiqh. In fact, in one account that basically comments on this statement by Ibn Sina and the quite well-known fact that he used to drink wine, the writer basically defends him by saying that he drank wine because he, quote, belonged to the Hanafi school of law. Now, the fact that he drinks sharab, which is the word that he uses, which is interpreted by most as wine, and thus maybe the grape wine that even Hanafis prohibited, that's another matter. I suppose we don't know the exact nature of the wine that he drank, but it is an interesting side note that might collapse this part of my argument altogether. But to strengthen the argument even more, though, there's a contemporary source talking about another famous scholar at that time, Abu Sulaiman as-Sijistani, which argues in a similar way, quote, although drinking wine is a controversial subject, he would partake of it on the grounds that he belonged to the Hanafi rite. This shows that by the turn of the first millennium, this was still a position that was strongly associated with the Hanafis. So what changed? Clearly today, if you ask any Hanafi jurist, they will say that any form of alcohol is forbidden in any quantity, right? And this seems to have been their position for a long time. So when did this position change? This is really well outlined in an article by Najam Haider called Contesting Intoxication, Early Juristic Debates over the Lawfulness of Alcoholic Beverages. In the 10th century, one of these central Hanafi figures was Abu Ja'far Ahmed al-Tahawi. In fact, he is one of the figures that significantly incorporated some of the teachings and methodologies of al-Shafi'i and his circle into the Hanafi framework, for example, placing a much larger emphasis on hadiths, including single transmitted reports, in deriving normative law. Despite this, however, he mostly followed his Hanafi predecessors in the question of intoxicants. According to Najam Haider, basing himself on Tahawi's al-Mukhtasar, quote, At-Tahawi considers lawful any water-based drink, for example nabidh and naqi, produced from a source other than grapes and dates, like honey and grain, regardless of its physical characteristics or production methods. When such drinks are made from grapes or dates, on the other hand, the legal situation is more problematic. Abu Hanifah is associated with the opinion that these substances are reprehensible, makruh, and to be avoided once they have matured and begun to bubble. To quote directly from the Mukhtasar, and Hisham ibn Ubaydullah, may God's mercy be upon him, said that Abu Hanifah, may God be pleased with him, disliked beverages from infused raisins, infused bisr, which is unripe dates, and infused dates, and he's referring to when they are cooked, while he does not mind infused figs and pears. And Abu Yusuf, may God be pleased with him, said that we dislike infused dates and raisins and forbid it. And Muhammad al-Shaybani, may God be pleased with him, said, I dislike that which intoxicates in large amounts, but I don't forbid it. And this is our opinion. At-Tahawi here thus affirms that he agrees with the earlier scholars like Shaybani about narrow prohibition, while also interestingly adding that Abu Yusuf supposedly viewed raisins in a similar problematic way as dates and grapes. At-Tahawi also interestingly engages much more directly in his writings with the counter-arguments and traditions employed by the Malikis and Shafi'is against narrow prohibition, such as in his Sharh Ma'ani al-Athar. For example, in response to certain hadiths, such as the one that states that all intoxicants are khamr, he counters that with other hadiths where the companions of the Prophet consumed wine, such as the one we quoted earlier from Shaybani's writings, where the Caliph Omar would use water to dilute an intoxicating beverage and still drink it. Clearly then, he still upheld the basic position of the Hanafis while engaging more directly with the supporters of general prohibition and perhaps making some efforts to move closer in dialogue to the opposite position. It's only later on, in the 11th and 12th century, that we really start seeing a shift within the Hanafi school. Already with as-Sarakhsi, there is a slight move toward a more restrictive attitude. While he still maintains the basic position and arguments of the earlier Hanafis, he does have a more restrictive attitude toward drinks made from raisins and others. It's also with as-Sarakhshi and the even later al-Marghinani that we see a new portrayal of the positions of ash-Shaybani, who we studied before as one of the original members and founders of the school. In these later medieval thinkers, ash-Shaybani is portrayed as prohibiting many or perhaps most other intoxicating drinks aside from the narrow khamr. Now, as we've seen from Shaybani's own writings, this isn't really an accurate historical portrayal of him. Even at-Tahawi affirmed that Shaybani saw non-khamr intoxicants as lawful, even if highly discouraged. So, this is probably historically incorrect. But this would become an important inspiration and cause for what would come next, namely the complete shift of the Hanafi school toward the stance of general prohibition. From the 12th century or so, all alcoholic beverages were now prohibited in all quantities, thus now agreeing with all the other schools. And this is the position that the Hanafis hold to this very day. The reconfiguration of the positions of ash-Shaybani was an important factor in this, and we indeed find this argument used today, right? People will argue this even in the YouTube comments that, right, while Abu Hanifah, so this is what the argument will be, that while Abu Hanifah allowed non-grape intoxicants, ash-Shaybani didn't, right? But as we've seen, this is really not historically accurate. Instead, we see a gradual development of the internal argument within the Hanafi school and an increased adoption of the methodologies and arguments of rival schools, and eventually a gradual shift in the position within the Hanafi camp. This remains, in other words, a prominent and important part of the story of the Hanafi school, even if their stance is very different today. Indeed, you basically won't find any Hanafi scholar today that holds the same position on intoxicants as the early representatives of the school. Although some contemporary scholars have revived these earlier rulings in modern and unique circumstances to, for example, make it easier for people who are sick to accept certain forms of medicine that might contain traces of alcohol. Right, so following a more narrow prohibition of the classic Hanafi school makes such modern questions, let's say, easier to resolve for contemporary Muslims. So while the situation today is definitely a lot different compared to back then, we can see that it still remains relevant in some cases and discussions. This is a good and interesting topic to realize that even such very commonly understood basic features of a religion like Islam is not always so cut in stone as we might like to believe. That even a position like the prohibition of alcohol was nuanced in the early Islamic civilization, in early Islamic jurisprudence. Even though the majority of the early Islamic schools of jurisprudence, the Malikis, the Shafi'is, the Shi'i schools, the Hanbali school, right, it was really only the Hanafi school, at least in terms of a school, that held this position. But still, the Hanafis were a significant school. In many periods, they were the dominant school, even in this early period. But so this shows you that things are often a lot more nuanced and complicated in the world of religion and history than we often like to believe. Thank you so much for listening and watching. I hope this was informative and that my sources in the original sources were enough to convince you that I'm not just pulling this out of thin air, but this is actually commonly accepted in scholarship, even Muslim scholarship. This is not something that's unknown, right? At least among specialists, but maybe the general population seem to maybe not know about this history. And I think it's worth pointing these things out to show that things are, as I said before, a lot more complicated than we maybe are first led to believe. So again, thank you for watching. I would like to extend a special thank you to my patrons, as always, who keep this channel going, without whom none of this would be possible. So if anyone else wants to support this channel and support my mission of bringing you free educational content on the world's religions and philosophies and mysticisms, then I will leave links to that in the description. You can also leave a one-time donation through Patreon. That is, I believe that's a possibility now. But also you can leave a one-time donation through PayPal. And there are links to all of that in the description. If you want to follow me and my work elsewhere, you can find me on my socials, like on Instagram, on TikTok. You can also follow my other channel and subscribe to it called Filip Holm, which is dedicated to my music, playing my music and talking about music and the history of music and music theory and all these juicy, wonderful things. So go subscribe to that channel for more content. Or you can also check out my link tree in the description and in the pinned comment, where you can find all my links to everything that I'm up to and all the places where you can find me, including my website. So go check that out. Again, thank you so much for listening. I'll see you next time.